Well, good evening everyone, and a very warm welcome to this, the fifth in our series of Gifford lectures this October 2021. My name's Emma Wildwood and I work in the School of Divinity here in the University of Edinburgh. And it's a pleasure to welcome so many of you to this lecture. Those of you who've been able to attend other lectures will know that we've had a masterclass of considering the developments of Christianity as a global movement over the last few evenings. And I'm delighted to welcome our distinguished speaker, Professor Hempton, Senior Professor and Dean of the University of Harvard at the Divinity School, as he continues his Gifford Series on this theme that you see before you, networks, nodes and nuclei in the history of Christianity from 1500 to 2020. This evening we will hear the fifth of his sixth lectures, entitled Women's Networks, Opportunities and Limitations. And I'd like to remind you that the lecture and questions this evening are being recorded, and the video will be available shortly online on the University's Gifford Lectures webpage and blog. So I now have great pleasure in handing over to Professor David Hempton. Thank you.
Thanks, Emma, very much. I'd like just to begin this evening with a bit of a shout out to students at Edinburgh and Harvard. Special thank you to Victoria Turner and her team of bloggers and respondents who have kept going really a terrific website summarizing the lectures and dealing with some of the questions and offering some really high quality responses. I'm very grateful. Very grateful also to the graduate students of the University of Harvard, and especially to the North American Religions Colloquium, who have been really helpful in chasing sources and sharing ideas and helping me along. It does feel like these lectures have been put together by a real village. And one final thing maybe is just to say, with this lecture in mind, a big thank you to the Women's Studies and Religion program at Harvard Divinity School, and its director, Anne Brady, who bring year by year very distinguished scholars of women in religion to Harvard. I've learned more than I can say over the past decade from those scholars. So, on we go. Let's get my... So this lecture is animated by an overarching question from which other questions naturally flow. What are the characteristics of the religious networks, nodes and nuclei constructed by women? And to what extent do they function differently from those built largely by men? In attempting to answer that question, I will identify 5 different kinds of networks and look at some case studies within each category. In practice, these networks may have overlapping characteristics, but are nevertheless sufficiently distinctive for purposes of analytical clarity. I should make clear at the start that the following questions in typology should not be read as either an ascension or declension narrative about women's agency and the role of patriarchy in shaping female agency. Saba Mahmood remains an influential voice in contending, quote, for an analytical language for thinking about modalities of agency that exceed liberatory projects, feminist, leftist, or liberal. Women, either as individuals or in groups or networks, act within and upon political, ethical, and cultural contexts which they shape and are in turn shaped by. Historians, sociologists, and other commentators like us may have pre-assigned sets of values that enable them to make judgments on the ethical validity of whatever agency is being exercised. But we should be careful not to delegitimize agency because they happen to disagree with the purposes for which it is exercised. Put another way, women within religious traditions, however patriarchal those traditions appear to be, have found all kinds of ways of finding empowerment and fulfillment that may not fit well into progressive emancipatory paradigms, but operate in other kinds of frameworks. As my colleague Catherine Breakus has concluded, female agency, even in very conservative religious traditions, takes place within structures as well as against them, is always shaped by cultural norms and constraints, operates within a continuum, not a binary, is always marked by gender, racial, and class disparities, and does not have to be associated with freedom and emancipation, or intentional or unintentional subversion of patriarchy. One must also be careful not to exaggerate the role of female agency, both intentional and unintentional, in causing complex historical changes to which they may indeed be significant contributors, but along with some other factors. Finally, however careful one is not to ideologically disqualify the role of female agency, especially in conservative religious traditions, it's good to be reminded of Ruth Bader Ginsburg's oft-quoted ethical imperative, quote, "Women belong in all the places that decisions are being made." That is demonstrably, unfortunately, not the case in the patriarchal hierarchies of many religious institutions, which is why the study of female networks is of such vital importance. So to be clear, my task in this lecture is to bring to life women's transnational religious networks, nodes, and nuclei, and to ask the questions how they differ from those constructed by men, rather than to engage in a rigorous theoretical and practical evaluation of female agency itself. Here then are my 5 categories. The first are those networks that operate mostly within religious denominations or traditions as expressions of piety, fellowship, community, and mutual support. These networks, some of which were established by men at their very beginning, are generally not designed to challenge male hegemony directly or undermine religious traditions. There are multiple examples within mainstream denominations of all kinds and ethnic backgrounds, and still others like Aglo International, which are trans-denominational, transnational, and are held together by a shared theology and vision. A second category of networks are those that were not established by women for a particular feminist purpose, but came either to be dominated by women or were utilized by women in ways that shaped their cultural outcomes and impacted the experiences of their female participants in major ways. Examples include the Protestant missionary societies and organizations like the Student Christian Movement, both of which opened up a wide range of transnational experiences for women. A third category are those transnational networks of women that enabled them to create nodes in which they got to call most of the shots, but in which they also had to operate within pre-existing structures and spaces of maleness, colonialism, race, and economies. Examples include the female Catholic religious orders like the Ursulines, which established networks of spiritual economies throughout the world in the colonial era. A fourth category are those female networks that are created specifically to put pressure on male-dominated religious traditions to promote change and equality. These include the Catholic feminist movements of the 20th century, formed by women to end or modify an all-male priesthood or campaign for female reproductive rights. Finally, there are networks fashioned by women on the margins of religious traditions to promote solidarity and community in the face of patriarchal theologies, structures, and control mechanisms which women find unacceptable. Examples include female progressive movements within conservative religious traditions, such as conservative religious traditions like American evangelicalism and Mormonism. The fourth and fifth categories enunciated here often allied into one another. Women's networks sometimes start as attempts to pressurize male hierarchies to change their theologies and policies. Sometimes they meet with partial success, and sometimes they just fail. Even when their primary objective fails, however, many of these networks adapt by creating new spaces for women to thrive beyond the reach of male establishments, while still affirming their commitment to the faith traditions they badly want to change. So a good place to start here is with a confession of the soul. Although I had worked on Methodism as a popular religious movement for several decades, It took a long time for me to absorb the reality that Methodism, both demographically and functionally, was predominantly a female religious movement, as indeed are most Western religious traditions. In my defense, weak though I now know it to be, the animating questions confronting me as a young doctoral student and the preponderance of materials in Methodist archives all pointed to a different set of analytical categories around political culture, institution building, internecine squabbles, theological polemics, conflicts based on social class and anti-Catholicism. But once the light was turned on that Methodism was a predominantly women's movement, a whole fresh set of analytical categories came into view. In Methodism, Empire of the Spirit, I wrote, quote, that as purveyors of hospitality, deaconesses, visitors, evangelists, prayers, exhorters, testifiers, class members and leaders and preachers, women define the character of the Methodist movement. Extending further, some historians of Methodism focused their attention on female Methodist discourse, revealing a greater preoccupation with physical pain, suffering, and the fragility of life, occasioned by their own experiences of childbirth, infant mortality, primitive medicine, visitation of the sick and the vulnerable, and the mutual support of other women. Women were also central to the generational transmission of faith to children and to the hospitality networks around which the whole movement depended for the maintenance of an itinerant ministry and an organization built around classes and small groups. Looked at this way, the nucleus of Methodism looks somewhat different from that imagined by predominantly male historians. Similarly, the networks of women, both informally in the day-to-day interactions of Methodist women and more formally through classes organized by gender and marital status, were far more pervasive and influential than historians have recognized, at least until the 1980s. What is true for Methodism largely holds for its daughter movement, Pentecostalism. As with Methodism, the majority of worldwide Pentecostals are women, roughly in the proportion of 3:2 or higher in some places. In some respects, gender roles are remarkably similar to those of Methodism in an earlier period. Hierarchical roles in Pentecostal traditions are held by men, though there has been a tradition of charismatically gifted female leaders and preachers in American and Global South Pentecostal traditions. David and Bernice Martin have drawn attention to the generative ambiguity of gender roles within Pentecostalism, which they state has often been, quote, dismissed as old patriarchy revived, but that has to be set against the gender paradox analyzed by so many researchers and the fact that this is a women's movement. In the exhilarating mobilization of those not heard from before, the women are the movers and the shakers. The gender paradox is understood to be the asymmetry between the hierarchical positions of leadership held by men on the one hand, and on the other hand, the ways in which women have been enabled to promote family disciplines and moral order in the domestic sphere against male machismo and libertinism. A primarily women's organization arising out of Pentecostalism, Aglow International, formerly known as Women's Aglow Fellowship, was described in an important ethnographic study in the 1990s as the largest interdenominational women's organization in the United States and probably the world. Begun in 1967, Aglow had its origins in the charismatic movement of the 60s. And now, according to its website, it is, quote, a kingdom community of more than 200,000 warriors, champions and global leaders who touch 17 million people annually in over 170 countries around the world. Aglow started initially as the women's version of the Full Gospel Men's Business Fellowship and soon became a movement of women, for women, and by women. The organization now has what it calls men of Issachar groups, which are named after a verse in the Hebrew Bible about men who understood the times. Aglow has identity, vision, and mission statements, a standard charismatic evangelical statement of faith, emphasizing the baptism of the Holy Spirit and tongue speaking, and is essentially a worldwide network of small groups of women meeting for prayer, Bible study, and social action. In particular, self-declared mandates are to promote gender reconciliation under biblical principles, to minister to Muslims, and to stand in loving support of Israel and the Jewish people, which tells you something about the theological orientation. Within that broad umbrella, the social actions of local groups from country to country are mostly directed at local and culturally specific issues that directly affect the well-being of women in their communities, including sexual trafficking. Aglow is also an evangelistic organization with a commitment to reach the unreached, with a special interest in making an impact on the geographical zones between the 10th and 40th parallels, which are also regions with strong Muslim concentrations. Aglow International is a hierarchically organized international network of small groups called lighthouses in the United States and candlelight groups in the rest of the world, with its headquarters in Edmonds, Washington, and with a woman president, Jane Hansen. In her ethnographic study of Aglow groups in New England, Marie Griffith draws attention to a somewhat different version of the gender paradox identified earlier, namely, quote, conservative evangelical women who believe that their true liberation is to be found in voluntary submission to divine authority. That's true liberation. She concludes that for the women of Aglow, notions of submission and surrender, of secrecy, openness and intimacy, and of healing and transformation, all of which are enacted through prayer, through stories, and through changed behavior in everyday life. All these provide these women with means of reinventing themselves, of making room for new selves within a social context that is also believed to be made new. Griffith's critical empathy leaves room simultaneously for claims of female agency in constructing new lives of disciplined devotion, and for feminist critiques that these new selves are largely fashioned within patriarchal constructions of authority and control exercised by men. The nucleus of Aglow is a gendered view of how kingdom values expand throughout the world, expressed in the phrase from its website, quote, that men make mountains and women crush chaos. With a woman president, a majority female board, 9 of 11, and a network sustained by sophisticated messaging, national and international conferences and tight fellowships of women in small groups, Aglow has been around for over half a century and shows no signs of decline. And you can see from this interconnected map just how global these groups now are. Aglow is an example of a transnational interdenominational network organized specifically by women for women. But there are other transnational Christian networks that were not initially started by women, but within which women have exercised disproportionate influence. One important example are the Protestant missionary societies, which were initially started by men, but by the end of the 19th century, women's mission organizations with their army of local auxiliaries existed in nearly every Protestant denomination. In 1900, around 57% of American Protestant missionaries were women, a proportion that continued to increase into the early 20th century. Moreover, the presence of unmarried women, along with missionary wives, meant that missionary women outnumbered missionary men by nearly 2 to 1 in all the major mission fields. The implications of these statistics are enormous, not just for the lives of the women who sailed from America and other places to foreign destinations in their tens of thousands, but also to understand better the character of 20th century American imperialism at home and abroad. This global network of American Protestant women, through their impact on education, healthcare, social activism, and the lives of women and children, were both witting and unwitting agents of what has been termed, quote, a soft imperialism, a gendered analysis of which is essential if scholars are to explore how American empire is perceived, experienced, and negotiated around the world. The sheer scale of the impact of American and European missionaries on the rest of the world in the 20th century is as impressive as it is hard to evaluate. The difficulty is caused not only by the relative lack of research on the extensive geographical networks of women missionaries from multiple denominational and independent traditions, but also by the geopolitical, theological, and socio-cultural turbulence of the 20th century, which makes it difficult to get a handle on it. Disrupted by 2 world wars, fierce theological conflicts between liberals and fundamentalists, the demise of colonialism and the rise of nationalist movements, and persistent contests between female empowerment and male instruments of control, women frequently found themselves embroiled in mega changes which they could never fully control and from which they were often the victims. In the midst of this complexity, several important points stand out. The first is the persistent determination of women missionaries to bear witness to what they consider to be the truths of the gospel and its liberationist possibilities, whether as representatives of women's missionary organizations, holiness traditions, or faith mission style evangelistic enterprises. American women missionaries, however sensitive they were to indigenous cultural sensibilities, generally believed that all people deserved the triple advantages of Protestant Christianity, American civilization, and American forms of government. Inevitably, that triptych could carry with it an anti-Catholic, anti-Orthodox church, and anti-non-Christian religions charge. It could carry with it a chauvinistic approach to local racial and cultural realities, and flag-waving potential that was often modified, if not eliminated, by female agency in meeting real human needs. Sometimes the most effective tools of influence were also the most subtle. Second, there's an almost relentless determination by men, whether on mission boards, in denominational leadership, or in other structures of power, to establish bureaucratic control mechanisms to ensure that women missionaries stayed within the boundaries of what they deemed to be acceptable behavior, to set the guardrails. For example, in the interwar years, partly to get control of the money raised by women, and partly as a result of theological changes within American Christianity, many American denominations eliminated their national female mission organizations. According to Dana Robert, quote, ironically, a movement that had sought empowerment for Christian women around the world found itself disempowered by patriarchal forces within the Western churches themselves. In the history of Christianity, Dana writes, the charismatic leadership of women has often been supplanted by more formalized male leadership, and women's missions fit the pattern. The most controversial issue was invariably who controlled the money. Women raised it, and men often extorted it from them for the purposes they deemed most essential. Another point to emphasize is that for the most part, Western women missionaries thought they were the beneficiaries and therefore the representatives of a Christian civilization, which for all its weaknesses had delivered to them education, skills, and freedom to choose their own paths. Hence, women, both consciously and unconsciously, transmitted aspects of Western civilization, including its cultural and theological shifts over the course of their lives, and filtered back experiences and perceived lessons from their chosen destinations. In that sense, understanding the transnational dimension to women's missions has to be geographically capacious, both within and without the United States. Women seem to have been particularly influential Christian ambassadors, not only in the lives of other women and children in host cultures, but also in empowering indigenous leaders, both men and women, because they were perceived not to be in such obvious competition for power and control of indigenous churches in the way that male missionaries were often perceived to be. There are many examples of women helping to educate, train, and empower indigenous male leaders. One reason why missionary women were able to educate and train indigenous men had to do with a racism against men of color and men in other cultures that were presumed not to be equal to Western men, who, unlike children, could not be taught by women. Finally, as more of the research on female missionaries gets done and their full-orbed story gets told, the more complex is the resulting picture. US women's missionary work both fed and undermined empires, national states, and the free reign of capitalist markets. Female missionaries both reinforced racism and exclusion at home and abroad, but on occasions helped undermine it in service of a female internationalism. Women were always operating within constraints imposed by mission boards, political pressure, colonial realities, and indigenous sensibilities. Mostly they were neither fully independent actors nor unquestioning adherents to pre-assigned ideologies of race, nation, and gender. The dominant theme here is the insistent ambiguity of women's experience and legacy. The fast-paced globalization of Christianity in the last century has produced a situation where most world Christians live in the global south, and the majority of that majority are women. Although networks of Western women missionaries in the 19th and 20th centuries did not produce those statistics single-handedly, there can be no doubt that they played a very significant role, not just in the bare demographics, but also in the characteristics of indigenous Christian traditions, which are now themselves the centers of missionaries. One religious tradition that now finds itself in the crucible of the changes in global Christianity and the participation of women in those changes is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. In 1996, for the first time, more Mormons lived outside the United States than lived inside. This startling shift from the original mission strategy of Mormonism to gather its devotees to its central geographical node in Utah was accomplished by a wide range of factors. They include centrally directed missions and dissemination via the growing networks of globalization, including trade routes, migration patterns, channels of information, and government service. Change and growth in global Mormonism was both vigorously orchestrated from the center, but also serendipitously generated from the peripheries. Important to the story are three policy changes. One in 1898, adding women to the missionary ranks. The second in 1978, when the church issued a statement effectively ending racially based restrictions to the priesthood. And the third in 2012, lowering the age requirement for Mormon women from 21 to 19, thereby increasing the pool of unmarried women. By 2016, there were some 75,000 Mormon missionaries, over a quarter of whom were women. No other religion, Christian or not, comes even close to maintaining this number of full-time missionaries. For Mormon women missionaries, many of the same patterns play out as with women missionaries in other Christian traditions. There were opportunities for leadership and foreign travel, to develop new skill sets and growing self-confidence, but also coping with demeaning stereotypes and male control mechanisms. As with women missionaries, so with their female converts, Mormonism offers women in the global south some of the same advantages as other fast-growing Christian traditions like Pentecostalism. That is, clear moral boundaries and family stability, an ability to translate the communal orientation of village life to urban settings, and an acceptance of patriarchy in exchange for greater emotional and material security for women and their children. Where the Latter-day Saints depart from other Christian traditions, however, is in the benefits that a wealthy global church can provide its members in terms of language training, financial help, and a sense of belonging to a global network of Mormonism. Colleen McDaniel writes that, quote, "The very lack of Mormon architectural or ritual diversity signaled that one belonged to an international organization, not simply a local one. The widespread reach of the church was seen as evidence of the truth of its message. A South African could go to church in Botswana with her American missionary companion and feel right at home. Mormonism, more than most other religious traditions, exported its brand unapologetically, confident both in its truth claims and organizationally determined to bring the medium and the message into close harmony." Aside from the Mormons, the heyday of Protestant women missionaries from the United States was in the century between the Civil War and the Second World War. But in the decades immediately after World War II, another form of transnational Christian service opened up for thousands of young American women. The student Christian movement and its many connected organizations, such as the YWCA and the World Student Christian Federation, denominational campus ministries, and later the University Christian movement, opened up new opportunities for leadership, international travel, and education in the causes of social justice at home and abroad. Most of these organizations were not led by women, but most had influential women leaders and staffers. For young women in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, especially the growing cohorts of college students, these organizations introduced them to the great social and political issues of the day around racism, civil rights, colonialism, and anti-Vietnam War activism. In the words of one of them, these organizations, quote, changed their world and their worldview. It took them out of the context in which they were raised and introduced them to radically different perspectives in other parts of the country and around the globe. It also opened up to them their own capacities. The nucleus of this global student movement of women was a concept of Christian service that was not rooted in older paradigms of proselytism, conversionism, colonialism, and denominationalism. What shines through in the collective autobiographies of the women who have recorded their stories is a shared commitment to an expansive national and international vision of a world order that could be revolutionized by a compassionate and socially conscious ethic of service and transformation. The nodes that helped give expression to this vision were university campuses and huge national and international conferences, such as the 1959 18th Ecumenical Student Conference at Athens, Ohio, attended by students from all over the world and addressed by Martin Luther King Jr. Arising from that conference was the idea for a new form of service in the shape of frontier interns who would travel to strategic frontiers and share in the collective struggle for justice. The networks of national and international service opened up by these organizations transformed the lives of women and opened up future careers for them as campus ministers, university professors, ordained ministers, women's rights advocates, leaders of social justice organizations. It is striking how many of these women started out in Methodist youth organizations, showing both the longevity of that tradition's associational and radical social roots and its practices of lay leadership. It is also noteworthy how some of these women, whatever their religious traditions, had to conceal aspects of their lives, including their sexual identities, even in the supposedly radical currents of the 1960s and 1970s. Finally, the women who came together to tell their stories in the book Journeys That Opened Up the World capture the flavor of women's networks that are less amenable to prosaic historical reconstruction. And here's a quote from one of them. Our intersecting and overlapping stories brought gales of laughter, tears of remembrance, and gasps of surprise as we realized not only how much we had forgotten, but how much we never knew, each in her own niche. For these women, camaraderie built community, and community built capacity, sometimes not fully recognized even until later in their lives. A third category of transnational women's networks, also motivated by mission, are those created by female Catholic religious orders which have deep roots in European societies long before the Reformation and Counter-Reformation. What changed in the 16th century was the fact that some of these religious orders expanded westward to the Americas alongside the Iberian and French colonial empires. The women who founded the oldest cloistered convent in South America, Santa Clara in Cusco, Peru in 1558, and those from other religious orders who followed them, not only carved out sacred space for their prayers and rituals, but also played important roles in the construction of Spanish colonial hegemony. The three colonial convents of Cusco, Santa Clara, Santa Catalina, and Santa Teresa, were virtually little cities within the city and were spatially and ritually organized around the intense spiritual disciplines prescribed by their orders. The nuns and the subordinate lay sisters and various categories of mestizos under their care organized the daily practices of convent life around their sacred vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. But they were also subservient to the requirements of the patriarchal fathers of the Cusco colonial economy. The nuns of Cusco were not operating within some sort of detached spiritual islands of religious devotion, but they were active agents in the local economy through their dowries, their property ownership, their lending practices, and their produce for the market. The spiritual economies of the convents became vital cogs in the wheels of the Andean colonial order. For a long time, they were beneficiaries as well as servants of this colonial order. But a series of economic changes in the late 18th century and the rise of nationalist movements in the 19th century eroded their social salience and confined them ever more to the solitude of the cloisters. In this way, the female religious orders of Cusco and many other places in the Iberian empires expanded their nodes and networks through colonialism, then had their autonomy and practices moderated by the patriarchal necessities of imperial control, and then had their influence reduced by the forces of colonial resistance. The obvious conclusion from the Cusco example is that networks constructed by the female Catholic orders through colonialism, however rigorously constructed around the spiritual rules of their respective orders, could never function outside the social structures and expectations created by colonial elites. What was given on the one hand could be taken away by the other. A similar pattern, but with different results, is evident in the experience of the Ursulines who arrived in New Orleans in 1727. The Ursulines built a formidable network of over 300 schools in 17th century France and were an order devoted to the education of women and girls. What made the New Orleans experiment especially interesting and intriguing and complicated is that the Ursulines arrived in Louisiana under the French Empire from 1727 to 1767, and then had to adapt to Spanish imperial control from 1767 to 1803, and then found themselves part of the new American Republic. So three different owners in that 100 years. Further complicating the role is the fact that they educated women and girls of European, Native American, and African descent, and were both slave owners and practitioners of racial integration in their elite boarding schools. It's a complicated pattern. When the United States purchased Louisiana in 1803, there were only 2 other convents in the nation, both in Maryland. But in the subsequent 3 decades, 10 other orders of religious women were established in a much greater geographical area. In her book, Masterless Mistresses, Emily Clark suggests that these Catholic female religious communities threatened the male Protestant political culture at the intersection of race and gender. They not only challenged the ideal of domesticity on which it rested by providing women with an alternative to marriage, they also offered a model of female benevolence with institutions that were not only governed by women, but operated by women who were themselves self-governing and self-supporting. Moreover, they blurred conventional racial lines by educating girls and women of color and allowing them to perform a number of roles anathema to the racially segregated South. Clark's argument is that these challenges to white male Protestant control of the new republic sometimes magnified anti-Catholicism because it seemed so threatening in the antebellum republic, which contributed directly to some very grim events, such as the burning of the Ursuline convent in Charlestown, Massachusetts in 1834 in Boston. A fourth category of women's networks which have come to the fore in the last half century are those constructed by women within hierarchical and patriarchal religious traditions, either to press for changes in denominational polities and policies, or to carve out space for women to define their own religious practices and priorities. Perhaps the best known examples are the Catholic feminist movements that emerged between the 1960s and 1980s, partly out of the optimism about church reform created by Vatican II, and partly as a distinctively Catholic expression of feminism. Given that the Roman Catholic Church is often regarded as almost the epitome of hierarchy and patriarchy, it's easy to assume that the words Catholic feminist are an oxymoron. But in her book, Catholic and Feminist, Mary Henold boldly states that the historical record of the 60s and 70s provides more than ample evidence that Catholic feminists existed, that they articulated a strong connection between their faith and their feminist principles, that they formed organizations to forward feminist agendas, that such organizations were networked into a larger movement of Catholic feminism, and that this movement had connections with the much larger American feminist movement. In other words, the Catholic feminist movement refers to a network of empowered people who held a dual integrated commitment to their Catholic faith and to the struggle for women's liberation. This movement had many different dimensions, from women intellectuals, theologians, and writers, to specific organizations campaigning for female ordination or reproductive choice, and also different strategies and tactics, from attempts to pressurize the church's leadership into concessions to constructing alternative forms of praxis within which women could take leadership. Generally speaking, Catholic feminists focused their early efforts on seeking dialogue with church authorities, but ended up expanding Catholic identity beyond the parameters prescribed by church officials. For example, the women's ordination movement, which arose out of a conference in Detroit in 1975 and sought direct dialogue with church officials after its second national meeting in Baltimore in 1979, failed to make an impact, resulting in a strategy shift away from seeking dialogue with a hierarchy to an increased emphasis on establishing separate women's communities on the margins of the church. One iteration of this trend, the Roman Catholic woman priest movement, focused on ordaining women to lead Catholic parishes without official sanction, while another, the Women Church Convergence group, bypassed priesthood altogether in favor of lay-led communities of faith meeting in homes, but still for recognizably Catholic worship and fellowship. There are now large numbers of independent Catholics, both conservative and liberal in the United States and other parts of the world, who remain fiercely Catholic but are not connected to the papacy and the hierarchy. Many left-leaning independents not only ordain women, but also perform same-sex marriages, open communion to all, and allow multiple religious affiliations. This evolution of strategy and practice over the issue of women's ordination was played out in similar ways around the issues of abortion and contraception. The organizations Catholics for a Free Choice, and now Catholics for Choice, was established in 1973 to serve as the voice of Catholics who wanted abortion on demand to be safe, legal, and available. It established significant international connections, but once again the church hierarchy played theological hardball over the issue and prevailed, at least superficially. What these feminist movements have demonstrated, however, is that while the patriarchal Catholic hierarchy has proved to be remarkably resilient, women's movements have also been successful in creating new forms of Catholic identity beyond the direct control of that hierarchy. To be sure, many women have left the church in protest at its intransigence, but many others have renegotiated the terms of their commitment in ways that allow them to remain Catholics and feminists. Moreover, without making any major political gains, Catholic feminists slowly, quietly assumed leadership roles as pastoral associates, pastoral administrators, theologians, liturgists, directors of religious education, seminary instructors, and other roles also. As the numbers of priestly vocations plummeted throughout the 80s and 90s, Catholic women, feminist or not, took up the slack and have helped shape the religious lives of countless Catholics and parishes across the country. Henold prefers not to call this cafeteria Catholicism, which allows Catholic women to pick and choose what aspects of church teaching they fancy, but rather a liberated Catholicism in which women understand that their religious lives are not imprisoned by male hierarchical power structures, which they cannot yet change, but which they do not allow to define them. As with Catholic feminists, so too with some other religious traditions with male hierarchies, including the Mormons. Colleen McDaniel shows how Mormon feminists have used the internet, publications, and occasionally direct action to protest church policies on LGBTQ issues, on the all-male priesthood, and the ultra-domesticated portrayals of the ideal Mormon housewife and family. On the whole, they have met with the same fate as Catholic feminists, and for some of the same reasons. The priesthood is still male. The hierarchy has not budged on issues stated to be essential to Mormon doctrine and practice, and women thought to be too extreme have been excommunicated. On the other hand, church leaders have had to adapt to new realities by authorizing less sanitized versions of the church's history a kind of double-edged sword, and to be somewhat more accommodating to LGBTQ issues without diminishing their commitment to the supposed divine endorsement of heterosexual marriage. Moreover, women continue to use the digital media and women's organizations to circumvent the structures of a highly centralized church. This somewhat uneasy tension between what the male hierarchy is willing to tolerate and what Mormon feminists want is not going to go away and may be exacerbated by the growing globalization of Mormonism. As McDonnell puts it, the traditional domestic lifestyle blogging of official Mormonism, quote, presents a perfect home life that excludes almost everyone, single women as well as queer women, but also non-American members, Mormons of color, poor women, and almost every married woman who is an ordinary disorganized household. The days are a-changing, and conservative religious traditions of all hues are having to renegotiate their boundaries. Evangelical Protestantism has a less centralized and hierarchical leadership structure than either Roman Catholicism or Mormonism, but its patriarchal credentials, at least in the United States, yield nothing to these other traditions. In her recent book, Jesus and John Wayne, Christian Kobes-Dumez assembles a great deal of evidence to show that white evangelicals voted for Donald Trump in the 2016 election, not despite their beliefs, but because of them. She writes, quote, evangelical support for Trump was no aberration, nor was it merely a pragmatic choice. It was rather the culmination of evangelicals' embrace of militant masculinity, an ideology that enshrines patriarchal authority and condones the callous display of power at home and abroad. This is a very well argued and put together book, arguing that there is this kind of tradition within evangelical Protestantism of endorsement of the military, of the police, of patriarchal control models, and that therefore, when it came to Trump as a candidate, evangelicals voted for Trump, not as an aberration, but as a natural dimension of their views. So this bold assertion is not without foundation, but possibly underestimates the myriad other factors around race, class, and social location that contribute to voting behavior in the United States. Others writing about the evangelical tradition have drawn attention to the precarious place occupied by evangelical women celebrities as wives, preachers, and writers as they negotiate between the fine lines of influence and expectation. According to Kate Bowler, these women must be pretty but not immodest, exemplary but not fake, vulnerable to sin but not deviant. So there's these kind of a narrow road of acceptability. Of course, there's another tradition within evangelicalism, both of strong independent women who exercise considerable influence within the tradition in Britain and America, and more generally of women who exercised leadership roles in times of novelty and expansion before men could re-establish control. In more recent times, there's been a positive treatment of those women who were decidedly not Trump supporters, the politically progressive women at the margins of the evangelical tradition. These women, both white and women of color, have used digital media, publishing networks, and conference gatherings to build robust communities and female-dominated counter-publics to contest the dominant male evangelical narrative, particularly around LGBTQ issues and social justice issues. Some of these women will join the ranks of disenchanted evangelicals and eventually find their way out of the evangelical tradition. But many others are using the tools at their disposal, digital, print, and conferences, to construct and disseminate an alternative evangelical narrative around gender, race, and political praxis. The situation is yet more complex for women in Black American religious denominations and traditions. On the one hand, research and writing about women in these traditions historically pay tribute both to the importance of the Black church and to the contribution of women's organizational networks within the church. to broadening the public arm of the church and making it the most powerful institution of racial self-help in the African American community. Conversely, women's negotiation for recognition and power within their churches and their communities can also be a source of real tension. In Anthea Butler's words, quote, "Women's authority to own their own sacred space and men's fears of women taking their pastoral authority have driven much of the organizational and strategic infighting in black churches. These tensions, articulated by historians of black churches in the 19th and early 20th century, have not gone away. A more recent study based on a national sample of 1,863 black churches across 7 denominations found that especially among Baptists and Pentecostals, opposition to racial injustice mostly takes precedence over issues of gender disparity within church hierarchies, including support, of course, for women pastors. Other big data surveys suggest that church networks are particularly important for African American women and may have positive benefits in terms of emotional and material support and physical and mental health. What these various historical accounts and survey data show is that although one needs to calibrate carefully by denomination, social class, and marital status, church networks are vitally important for African American women, but that they can advance social justice and racial self-help without necessarily making gains around gender equity. Here again, the times are changing, both nationally and internationally, as the World Council of Churches now organizes a Pan-African Women's Ecumenical Empowerment Network to develop leadership capacity and theological education for women of African descent throughout the world. This lecture began with the question of whether or not the nuclei, nodes, and networks constructed by women operate differently from those built by men. That opened up 5 subsidiary questions about the role of women's networks in the transmission of religious belief and practice over some 500 years. 3 important themes have emerged. The first is that most religious traditions and movements have majorities of women, but most are led by men and are based on deeply embedded patriarchal assumptions. That underlying reality, sometimes called the gender paradox, is played out in multiple different Christian traditions and shapes the subsequent contest for power, representation, and influence. A second theme is that women have found imaginative ways to create spheres of influence within and sometimes even control the religious traditions they inhabit. That influence has to be mediated not only by the structures of male power within religious traditions, but also by the structures of male power operating in the surrounding political, economic, social, and cultural arrangements. For example, however much female religious orders in the early modern period kept control of their institutions, they were always embedded in colonial structures and local economies, which were normally beyond their control. Finally, women's networks often serve different functions from those built by men, who begin with the luxury, that is, men begin with the luxury of centuries-old foundations of ideological, theological power, and who are also able to utilize the transmission agencies built by other men. In light of these disadvantages and discriminations, women, in common with other marginalized communities, often experience both the joys and the disappointments of their nodes and networks in more acute ways than the men who set the rules and organize the conditions. In that sense, womanhood itself is at the heart of the religious nucleus that bound together the Christian sisterhoods of women's networks as their shared sets of experience and values gave rise to a distinctive female consciousness, whatever the specific circumstances that called any given network into existence. Perhaps that, more than anything, is the secret of their enduring strength and influence. Women's religious networks are simply not going to go away.
That was very fun. Thank you so much for that lecture. I really like learning about female empowerment in the non-Western world and how it challenges my own feminism. There's just one thing that's like niggling me, and I'm very conscious that I want to say this right. But it's like kind of how we celebrate the resilience and the struggle of women and how they like control men, and this idea of like men's I think the word used is machismo, is that the word? And I'm just kind of wondering, that for me just plays into gender essentialism. And I'm just thinking, like, with the other networks, like, we don't say that, oh, patriarchy is patriarchy. We don't celebrate women's resistance to patriarchy. We mourn that there's a patriarchy. So in these interpersonal relationships, I'm just kind of wondering, like, why is that different? And does it kind of take the blame off men by saying, oh, that's just how they're made, kind of thing?
Thanks very much, Victoria. I found it a little hard just to pick up completely with a mask on, so I'll do my best. You're right to wave a red warning flag around that. It can so easily descend into... So in a sense, I'm not really endorsing this in any way. I'm simply describing, or what I think is what so many researchers call this gender paradox, that women get something from this, otherwise it would be difficult for them to be in it, but they don't get control and leadership, which is why I think I started off with that. So I started into this through the Sabu Mahmood thing, that that women's agency shouldn't always be organized around emancipatory or liberal things. But I also wanted to signal the Ruth Bader Ginsburg comment that women need to be at the points of decision where all important decisions are being taken. So from that point of view, I agree with your flagging of the question. I believe in the Ruth Bader Ginsburg statement. And therefore, anything that is used as somehow some additional male tool, that somehow they're it's the old Victorian woman in the home and has to be the kind of organizer of faith and morals, while men who are weak and feeble, go about their business and wreak disaster around them, and so on and so on. So I get that shades easily into gender essentialism, and shades easily, I think, into many religious traditions' defense of their male hierarchical structures. So in a way, I agree with you that, not in a way, I do agree with you, that, stating it like that as a principle is something to be niggled about and to be annoyed about.
Perhaps, whilst we're waiting for other questions, I may ask one. I've been really struck by the way in which you've tried to examine these transnational movements from all angles during the whole of the lecture series, and you've looked at different movements as they've travelled the globe. But I wonder whether there's something about knowing what happens, for example, the beautiful slide you have of the Aglo Ghanaian group, whether there's something about what happens in the places where there's this international spread that influences the network. So it's not simply about the missionaries who go out from North America or from Europe, or about the Aglo headquarters or the Mormon headquarters, right, but actually those farther reaches. And do you have any evidence of how that kind of goes back into the networks that you've been describing?
Yeah, that's a great question, a fair one. So I do think that these networks, once established, flow in multiple directions. It's not a unidirectional flow. And I'll say a little bit more about this in the last lecture, where I do think that flow is changing quite rapidly now in the digital age, when a lot of the flow of information and ideas and influence is really emanating from the global south in striking ways. So I think that pattern is changing, and it's partly, you know, a legacy of the colonial era. Having said that, I still think I have more work to do exactly what you've said. I mean, in a way, it worked for me in things like the New Spain shrines, or the cult of Our Lady of Guadalupe, which then begins to a very different kind of Lady of Guadalupe than the one in medieval Spain. Starts to go back across the world in very different ways from the ways in which it had arrived in New Spain. And I think there are many examples like that, you know, where whatever the nodal point is, that something changes, and a different set of ideas and cultural relations move along the networks. So these are not meant to be, I mean, I guess the danger a little bit with this kind of treatment is that it's easy to assume that the nodes are the ones we know about. But almost certainly the nodes are places that we don't know much about right now. I mean, I would guess in the kind of work that you do, or other scholars of indigenous traditions of Christianity in Africa, would have a very different set of nodes and junction boxes. You know, I know from the work or the conversations I had with Dana Robert about that was definitely the case. So there is, even in the historiography, or even in what I've done, I think, you know, I think your question is sharp about that there is a danger of going in that direction, and therefore I do think that, and this has changed, for example, pretty fast around Pentecostalism, where, I don't know the historiography of this extremely well, but my guess is that up until about 20 years ago, Azusa Street was the presumed node of all nodes for the Pentecostal. That certainly had appears in the work of David Martin and so on. Whereas I think as Pentecostal traditions throughout the world have constructed their own histories, with a decided sense of not wanting to be, you know, simply the followers of a West of United States event, but have their own story and narrative to tell. I think that's going to happen again and again. And one thing I'd like to do for the published version of these lectures is pursue that question a little further, actually. You know, what do these nodes look like from, or what do these networks look like? Not from the nodes that we know about, but from the nodes that we don't know that much about. Yeah, so it's a good question.
I think we have a couple of questions. Gemma, towards the back, to start with.
Something I noticed in the lecture was that you primarily focused on networks that were more formally organised as networks. And I was just thinking about whether you'd explored sort of more loose informal networks that I think are probably fairly significant in the context of women's networks. And thinking in the Church of Scotland during the ordination of women campaigns, there was originally a fairly formalised network with a name, but then in the middle of the campaign it got disbanded because the people involved decided that the formal network wasn't serving its purpose, and it would be better to maintain the momentum with a sort of more looser network.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think absolutely right. So the women's networks that have been studied most assiduously have been the ones that have records or archives, or you can go and do an ethnographic study of because you know what it is and where it is. But what I hinted at a little bit in the lecture is the point you've just made, is that when women's networks, however well organized, reach a point of failure, or at least failure is maybe not the right word, but don't achieve their initial objective, what happens after that? And often those networks either fragment into many different local versions, or sometimes organize themselves around different objectives that are less formally denominational and more in control of the women themselves. So in the Catholic examples I was giving, these women essentially just ran lay churches from their homes and did it that way. And it's very difficult to trace all of that because it becomes, very loose. So I think you're absolutely right that, we know most about, it's quite a similar point to Emma's in a way, that we know most about the things that we know about, and we know least about the things that are harder to find out about. I think that's going to change over the next, 10 or 20 years. I think what's exciting to me about this methodology is that it opens up the possibility of thinking about this more along the lines you've just indicated, because I think that gets you into, what I really most want to say about this is that this method that I'm using is not a kind of ideological construct that I'm defending because I believe in some kind of trifecta. I just think it's a way of getting at the lived religion of ordinary people in ways that you can make sense of. So in the case that you just mentioned, I'm still interested in the free-flowing, very loose networks, because that's the lived religion of ordinary people, even if it doesn't show up in the archives as specifically this reform movement within the Church of Scotland. So it's that I'm interested in more than, the network as a kind of ideological construct that I'm prepared to die in the ditch over. It's a construct that helps you get to the lived religion that I care about.
Another question from Samara Harvis.
Thank you very much for that. I found that very, very interesting. It's obviously something I think about endlessly, including in the early church, which is my own area of expertise. My question, and I'm sort of struggling to make this a question, is doesn't your own method reveal precisely why the women's networks do fail? I mean, what I've been so impressed at in your lectures all the way through has been the way in which you've pointed up how it's all about empowering the powerless and giving resistance, allowing people to find ways of resisting the arrogant. And this sort of resisting the arrogant has been a sort of theme running through everything that you said, really, and the way that people come together to resist the arrogant. Now, perhaps what's happened with women, so I'm going to put this to you, do you think this is possibly the reason why, obviously I know the Catholic scene best, the sisters, they've just all basically shut up shop. They don't want to take new novices, they're quite happy, they're drifting on towards death, and quite happy with that in many cases. But I wonder if that's precisely because women have got power in society in a way they didn't have when those women joined the religious orders in the 1950s and the 1960s. And that therefore the sort of that what's built into religious women's networks is always an empowering of the powerless. And once they get power, they start doing something else, if you like. The religion might still be the power behind that, but they move on and start helping refugees, or they move on and start doing medical care of different sorts, or running universities. So I mean, I wonder if they're sort of, I mean, I don't want to say victims of their own success, because it's almost a consequence of their own success is that these networks don't actually last. They're kind of too successful to last, if you like. They get the power and then they go on.
Yeah. Well, it's a very interesting question. I'm not, and I think it's well put. I'm not sure I fully agree with it, though. I don't think women's networks mostly move on having achieved a degree of success. I think in most of the religious communities that I've looked at for these lectures, women are still, whether it's Catholicism, evangelicalism, Mormonism, black churches, I think women are still in positions of some power differential with men. And often when they move on from a network, it's not because they have succeeded, but because they have failed and have had enough. So I have a doctoral student working on evangelical progressive women who, and I did a book on this myself called Evangelical Disenchantment narratives, where women, confronting the kind of male power structures of the evangelical tradition, simply gave up on that tradition because they got fed up with it. So I'm not sure that it's always as a result of, but the earlier part of your question is kind of right. I think, that I do whatever built-in historical gene pool. I do have a special interest in those who, poke their fingers at established traditions. As Jay Brown and I were discussing this over a meal last night. That's how our historical trajectory has gone. But I will say this, that in some of the populist traditions I've tried to explain, like, take last night, for example, the Darbyite fundamentalism that ripped through parts of the southern states. I'm not an enthusiast for that, and I think it's had disastrous consequences. So the populist isn't always best.
But you're identifying the power, where the power is, which is what I think is so.
Yeah, but so I guess the question would be, do those southern fundamentalists have power or not? Or are they behaving this way because they sense that the power of the old white Christian hegemony in the United States is almost over, and that the Trump era is the last hurrah of white Christian America? I mean, certainly many scholars think that's the interpretation. So, it's hard to know in examples like that where the power really lies. Does the power lie with these people, or are these people in sheer terror of the power being taken away from them? In a way, both are true at the same time. They have a window of power, or at least did have a window of power. But that power, I think, is assuredly not based on demographic realities in the long run. That's why it's so hard to understand sometimes, of why a great political party would follow along with it. Because ultimately it can't, short of so manipulating the electoral arrangements of the boundaries, the gerrymandering, the election officials, the counting of votes, all of that, short of doing that, can they really achieve a majority? But I think, your points are really interesting ones, and certainly, well worth thinking about. So thank you so much for your question. Any final question, maybe? Or,
I just would like to say that as long as God is seen as male, which of course he is in all Christian traditions, or she is in all Christian traditions, then women they have a strike against them, in trying to come out on top. And I think, Ruth Bader Ginsburg's comment is as far as women can expect to get within Christianity. So that's a comment, but I have a question as well, if I may, and that is, do you find evidence that women are prime movers in ecumenical movements or in ecumenism, as far as networks, nodes, and nuclei are concerned?
Yeah, well, two things. I mean, the point you make about the conceptualization of the divinity as male, obviously has a long history in the Christian tradition, and I actually agree with you. I think that, and you made this point earlier about, the last lecture about images of the Virgin or images of Jesus, or and for male, female, you could say black or white, or any number of. So how we construct theologically notions of the divine has enormous consequences for the kind of flow down of praxis. And then the second point you made about, I'm just trying to remember, just give me a clue again.
Ecumenism.
Ecumenism.
Women are
Yeah.
for ecumenism.
Yeah.
Within networks.
Yeah. I'm less certain about that in a way. I mean, I remember my old mentor that I paid tribute to last night, Reg Ward, thought that ecumenism was really the bastion of male educated ecclesiastical elites who moved from hotel conference to hotel conference debating theological constructions of not much interest to ordinary people. And essentially was nothing was more likely to kill Christianity as a popular religious tradition than that kind of set of encounters. I think that's probably a little harsh, but I could see what he was getting at, because I think for many scholars like him and others who have written about these popular traditions, there's no doubt about it that women achieve their moments of influence and power and in the very early stages of something new before men take over. So in Methodism, there were far more female itinerant preachers. Before theological colleges got formed and property trusts were set up, all men. So when the formal structures get built up, men take control, and they even edit women out of the story. It's actually quite hard to find these women in the archives because they're systematically excluded from the records. So I don't have a great deal of confidence in ecumenical leaders than I have in other kinds of leaders, and that betrays my radical anti-establishment personality. But I do think in more recent times, and I know some of these women who have invested a very great deal in ecumenism from the very best of intentions, and have had a tremendous influence over the World Council of Churches and other organizations. So I don't mean to diminish or demean that effort and the achievements that have been made. So maybe just put that on the record. Yeah.
I think we have one final question, and it needs to be the last one. Shadab.
Thank you for your lecture. Would it be a stretch to say that the various themes and contradictions that you've outlined could also be applied to secular traditions, spaces, and practices, which I at least have found to be as androcentric and patriarchal as manifestly religious spaces? Thank you.
Yeah, well, it's a good observation, and I trust your judgment. I'm sure you're absolutely right about that. Because in a sense, both of these, whether Christian or avowedly secular, are drawing on the same cultural constituencies and roots and wider social patterns. So it wouldn't be surprising In fact, it might be surprising the other way if there was a real marked difference between. I do think, however, I mean, I'm very interested in this. I wrote a book a while ago called Evangelical Disenchantment, and I got really interested in disenchantment narratives and what happens to people once they encounter certain traditions and just get fed up with them and give up and move on. And I think within that degree of secularism, there probably has been more of a, I think women perhaps have had more influence over parts of that. I mean, I'm thinking of some of the people I wrote about, you know, like the suffrage reformers of the 19th century, or even people like George Eliot that I quoted in a previous lecture, who, you know, gave up her early evangelical creed, became pretty well a secular humanist, and you know, was also a kind of you know, leading advocate for, you know, women's you know, influence and role in society. But I guess I just trust your observation. I think you're probably right about the way you framed it.
Well, on that note, we will have to leave it for this evening. But again, I would like to thank Professor Hempton very much for a stimulating lecture that has posed questions for many of us, and to you, the audience, for listening so attentively and responding so courteously. So thank you again for this evening.
Thank you.